I'll be honest, I don't know how to pronounce this title. I'm assuming it's Airport V, but it could be Airport 5. I googled it and didn't get any information, so I apologise if I'm just completely pronouncing this title wrong. But this episode is the 19th episode of the 6th season of Cheers. This is directed by George Wendt, which is pretty exciting. And the episode itself is really good. As always, there will be spoilers from now as I go through the episode chronologically and share some thoughts. Starts off with Norman, Cliff and Frasier, and Cliff is reading the paper and he points out that even things that are kind of outrageous have an element of truth to them. And Cliff decides to prove this by telling somebody in the bar he won $5 on the lottery, and his intention is for that person to spread it around, and then what we're left with is going to be some large claim that's based on the truth. And it didn't work. It didn't go according to Cliff's plan. But I have to say, and I don't say this often, I think Cliff had a valid point. That things are often truthful to begin with, and they just get blown out of proportion. And it's a fun way to start things off. We then have two parts to the narrative, and both are established pretty quickly. Rebecca comes into the bar and says that this influential reviewer is coming to the bar, and she says, "Need I say more?" And Woody replies, "Yes," which I rather enjoyed. And apparently it's actually somebody who's been to review the bar before. It didn't exactly go very well, and Rebecca's determined that this time will be different, and that Carla will be locked in the stories closet, and we'll come back to that narrative in a bit. Carla then comes into the bar, and Woody tells her that Eddie had called and left a message that he got a job as a penguin, and immediately Carla assumes that he's going to be playing for the Pittsburgh Penguins. Also, side note, I love her poodle sweater. I love her sweater with the little poodles. I think they were poodles. Absolutely adorable. And we have a really sweet moment between Cliff and Carla. Cliff says, "I'd say Eddie LeBec is on his way to becoming a legend." And Carla says, "Hey Cliff, what a great thing to say. Thanks." Carla saying thank you to Cliff is such a rarity. It was such a lovely moment. Cliff then said, "Can Eddie get us tickets?" But I thought it was a really nice moment. And then Eddie comes in, dressed as a penguin. And actually, I think I remember my thoughts on this one when I first watched this episode. If I'm not mistaken, I thought he was the mascot. He'd come in dressed as the penguin, so he was working for the Pittsburgh Penguins, but as a mascot. I was not right about that. Turns out he's actually performing in the wonderful world of ice. And Carla's a little shocked by this, but ultimately she still supports him, which I think was really sweet. And Eddie has to fly out to Seattle, and Carla kind of just brushes off the idea that she'll fly out to see him. We then cut to Carla on the phone at Cheers, and Eddie is on the line, once again talking about her flying out to see him, and she's been putting it off, and we'll come back to that in a moment. The critic then arrives, and Rebecca leaps over the bar, very obviously not Kirstie Alley doing that. Somebody can prove me wrong, but it was very impressive. And we have the critic Murray Treadwell, played by Peter Elbling, and it's a very creepy interaction. He says to her, well, he invites her out for dinner and she hesitates, and he says to her, "The more time you and I spend together, the happier I think you'll be with the review." How disgusting. How horrendous. I admire Rebecca for not immediately saying yes. And this is Rebecca who's, well, she's caught up on Evan Drake, but in general she's just desperate to find a mate. So that, coupled with the fact that she really wants Cheers to get a good review, meant that part of her could have just automatically said yes. But I respect the fact that she actually went behind the bar. She didn't leap over it this time. She went round the back and asked for advice, and ultimately decided to go on this dinner date. Eddie then calls Sam, and Carla's in the bar at this point, and Woody is actually the one who suggests to Carla that she might be afraid of flying. She cackles, she takes the beer away and laughs to herself. Clearly she's afraid of flying. And she does actually share this story about turbulence. Honestly, the story's not that scary. She and Nick were in the toilet together, and there was some turbulence. And yeah, turbulence is horrible, I've been on a plane with some turbulence and it is genuinely terrifying, but not enough to stop me going back on a plane. And Frasier then comes in and Sam explains the situation to Frasier, and Carla's not interested in therapy for this. And what's also really interesting about this, it's not that interesting, I'm overthinking it, but Sam explains to Frasier Carla wants to visit Eddie on the West Coast. He doesn't say Seattle by name. In fact, at no point is the name Seattle mentioned to Frasier, which is interesting because Frasier then goes on to be from Seattle. He moves to Seattle for the series Frasier, and I kind of wonder, they avoided having a plot hole or a narrative hole by not mentioning Seattle, because obviously if they mentioned Seattle, Frasier would probably have to say, I'm from Seattle. Whereas they avoided that, either intentionally or otherwise. I'm overthinking it, it just amused me. They also mentioned Diane because Carla's worried about electrotherapy, and Frasier says, I never treated Diane with any kind of shock inducement. Of course, now I wish I had. Which is so mean. I love Diane, I love a mention of Diane. It does seem like when Diane is mentioned now, it's never very favourably, but I will take any Diane mention that we can get. And Eddie ends up phoning again and tells Carla that it's just an excuse, that she's not afraid of flying, and I think that was enough to encourage Carla to go ahead with this. We're then on a plane with Frasier and a bunch of other patients. They're having a test flight and focusing on their happy place. I think there are some really great tips in this for getting over fears of flying. I'm not terrified of flying, but I don't mind being in the air, but I hate the takeoff and the landing. I really hate those. And I think there are some tips in this that might be good to remember. And he sits next to Carla ready for takeoff, and he says to her, if you get a little nervous, grab onto me, and she just slams her palm of her hand into his face. It was pretty great. We then cut back to Cheers, and they got the review, and it was a good review, and Rebecca didn't sleep with him, but everybody assumes that she did. And even Al got in on that and asked her what he was like, which was pretty funny. So I do believe Rebecca. Even Evan Drake phoned her and thought she'd slept with him. I don't think Rebecca would be happy of Mr. Drake thinking she slept with somebody else, considering she's interested in Mr. Drake. So it was an interesting enough scene, a nice way to kind of round off that part of the narrative. And then we're back on the plane. And in this very peculiar moment, everybody starts meowing. And I just assumed for a couple of seconds that it was a kind of self-soothing thing. And also it sounds funny. Meowing does sound funny. But actually, Frasier explains that's just a little kitty cat. CAT, clear air turbulence. I'd never heard of clear air turbulence, at least not by name. So I got a bit of an education there. And meowing, I don't know if the person next to me would be very comfortable with me meowing, but I rather enjoyed it quite a lot. And then it escalates. Frasier panics. He runs off the plane, well, runs down the aisle, calling for his mother. So even people who aren't afraid can feel scared in the moment, which I think is probably close to my experience. And I imagine a lot of people's experiences. I'm absolutely fine getting on a plane, getting ready to take off, but as soon as that engine rumbles and we start to roll forward, I could do with some meowing. We then cut back to Cheers. Carla's on the phone to Eddie, and she said that she'll definitely be flying out to Seattle soon because Frasier's class made her realise how silly it was to be afraid of flying. And then somebody else overhears this and asks for the same kind of help. She introduces him to Frasier, and Frasier is probably no longer in a place. He turns around and just responds, I'm in my happy place, which was just adorable. And yeah, he doesn't seem like he's in a place to help people with their fear of flying. It's a fun episode. Really thoroughly enjoyed it. I don't know if I have any personal highlights. I don't think there's any one specific the moment that really stood out to me. I guess the meowing. I just really liked the meowing a lot. It's a good episode. I think there are some really great tips in here for anybody who might be afraid of flying. And it's really nice to have some focus on Carla as well, because it's been a while. She was away for a bit with the babies and things. So it's nice to to get a little bit more with Carla here. Solid episode. Nice to have some Diane mentions as well. So I'm pretty happy. Airport 5, Airport V, somebody please tell me what it's meant to be, is, as always, a really great episode of Cheers.